It's another agricultural video. Prepare to enter the agri-zone. So the cool, deep lore for agriculture is that for most of our species' 300,000 years of visible existence, we just didn't do it. It was unnecessary. All the vegetation we ate was readily accessible as seasonal forage. Granted, starting maybe 30,000 to 25,000 years ago, there is some marginal evidence of people in, I think, China, Japan, and the Levant area, of people collecting the seeds of edible grasses, weeds, gourds, beans, and deliberately planting them to make that process even easier. Nothing resembling the intense monoculture that started appearing 12,000-ish years ago, but cavemen would move to a new area, and they would bring seeds with them. Adzuki beans, for example, were originally only eaten in India as far back as 50,000 BC, but by 13,000 BC, they had made it all the way to Japan, transported in the fur-lined pockets of cavemen. But then, of course, the Younger Dryas impact happened, I think, 13,000 years ago. Climate change, ice caps melt, sea levels rise, and with it come global flooding. The weather and seasons become more unstable, entire continents and land bridges disappear under the ocean, and with it the end of the natural abundance we saw in the Pleistocene, and the hot new scarcity of the Holocene. So now people gotta farm. Title drop: we live in a cereal society. The reason we have to pay taxes and have real jobs is because our entire civilization is structured around cereals. Capitalism, socialism, religion, oil. The Satan known as gluten did this to us. I will proceed to explain why. So, cereal has several qualities that uniquely enable our worst negative work-life tendencies and turn us into wages. The first is that cereal is just a lot of work. Cereal is easily the most work out of any of the staple crops we grow. You have to clear land, and then you have to till the land, seed the land, irrigate it. Then you have to harvest the cereal, thresh it, mill it into flour, and after all that you still have to bake the flour into bread. Only after completing all of those steps do you finally achieve the state of gluten. Henny Penny's friends aren't being as lazy as you think they are when they decline to help her. She's asking them to do an extremely labor-intensive task. Which is, of course, why the more people you have to help you do all of that, then the more cereal you can grow. More people, working more fields, harvesting more cereal means more food. Means more people and more cereal. This works even better if you can somehow trick or force somebody else to do all the difficult parts for you, and then just give the cereal to you at the end. You can kind of see how cereal almost immediately starts to introduce some modern ideas about production and labor. Which brings us to cereal's second 9-to-5 inducing quality. Cereal can be stored in large quantities either as just the dried kernels or as a flour. This makes it extremely quantifiable, measurable, rationable, and monetizable. Like most other food products are weirdly shaped, lumpy, uneven, heavy. If you take them apart, they start to rot. A cereal, on the other hand, can be ground up into flour and distributed on a pound-by-pound basis. So now with that in mind, you can have people developing weird ideas about rationing, wealth, maybe some kind of concept of wages or currency. You could start applying a flour amount to goods, tasks, or services. Eventually you can maybe even create discrepancies between people who do and don't have access to cereal, due to their role in society or whatever. You see, initially in smaller communities, people would just store their grain in a communal granary. No problem, don't worry about it. But as populations increased, society created strangers, and the government went from your dad to a large expanded power structure which eventually developed somewhat of a monopoly on violence and/or spirituality. Grain now becomes wealth, and granaries turn into important financial institutions instead of communal larders. In ye olde times, the miller was the tax collector because that was really the singular choke point where people and their cereal would congregate and allow themselves to be taxed. The miller would take his portion by weight, the farmer would get his flour, and everybody was as okay with it as they could be. Additionally, so too did ye olde baker become something of a welfare office. Bread was baked with standardized baking pans, minted with stamps as if they were coins, and either price-controlled in an effort to maintain conditions for working urbanites, or provided as a form of welfare to orphans, seniors, and widows. Hello, you have now reached the rice portion of the video. This is the rice segue. I repeat, this is the rice segue. Meanwhile, during the Edo period in Japan, they had something called the kokudaka, which was a registry that determined the taxable crop by the amount of rice your land was expected to produce based on previous harvests. Not the actual amount of rice you grew that year, mind you, but a predetermined estimation. Rice had to be taxed this way because it does not need to be milled. Rice could be taxed this way because all the planting and flooding was aggressively standardized. Rice also isn't typically broadcast like other cereals where you can just throw it at a field, but instead must be germinated separately in a bucket and then the grass transplanted manually. This is back-breaking tedium, and I don't think the automatic rice planter was invented until, like, the fucking 60s or 80s, my dude. Rice planting is actually why Japanese children get Golden Week off in spring, but then getting spring and summer off from school for planting and harvesting is a universal quality to most public education systems. Rice is insanely productive. The acre per calorie for rice is like 14 million, whereas the calorie per acre for wheat is only 4 million. Rice will grow like a literal weed in a flooded paddy and can be grown back to back in warm, wet, ideal conditions. The only real upper limit to rice production for most of history has been land, water, and labor. This has allowed rice to sustain massive populations and in turn produce an even greater positive feedback loop. More food, more labor. More food. Even in ye oldest times, China had millions of people due to rice production. Because of all the excess calories cereal creates, it allows the conditions within society that enable people to work jobs that aren't directly involved in food production. Artisans, metalworkers, assorted skilled and unskilled laborers, scholars, performers, large and more molestery religious institutions, and bureaucracies. With that in mind, cereal societies have a tendency to become aggressively stratified in an effort to keep the food growers growing food. Because if they stop growing food, and if you stop taxing them, everybody fucking dies. The most common historical strategy was to simply deny farmers freedom of movement and make it very difficult for them to stray too far from the land they worked. Both feudal Japan and the Soviet Union independently established a series of extensive checkpoints, passports, and borders in order to legislate the placement of farmers and keep them on their land working. For wheat and rice, this was actually a fairly intuitive system to implement, since growing cereal by yourself is super fucking difficult, and if you're an urban person, you unironically probably have no idea how to even do half the things required to turn grass into food. Cereal is great. It keeps everybody in their place. While information in cereal society is a lot more exclusionary, you need to remember, people in cereal societies can actually become experts in things. In caveman society, everybody has to not only devote themselves to some aspect of food production, but then you also typically need to vaguely know a million other fucking things by hand in order to be alive, like making tools, clothing, fire, etc. Very little can be outsourced, and information can actually be forgotten forever if it isn't used regularly. We spent 500,000 years in stagnation because any idea or concept that didn't directly produce food was gay. Most cereal cultivation is a monoculture, which means it has to be grown in a large fuck you field where only it resides at the expense of everything else. The exceptions include rye and oats, which originally grew as a weed in wheat fields, and corn, which can be grown more like a vegetable and companion planted with other produce like beans and squash. Anyway, this puts the cereal farmer in direct competition for land with not just other people, but other plants, namely trees. For people to feed themselves with cereal, land must be kept clear, trees must be cut down, and their stumps grubbed out. Historically, the #1 deforester of the world has been cereal cultivation. That's an actual certified bug fact. People commonly think that industrialization and the increased demands it brought towards wood burning and charcoal production was what led to en masse global deforestation, but charcoal burners were actually early adopters of coppicing and other forest management practices, explicitly because wood was their renewable resource to sustain. Ironically, Tolkien's vision of pastoral environmental harmony was somewhat of a fantasy. The post-wood crisis in ancient Greece, Rome, and Germany were particularly bad as the increasing demands brought by their growing populations led to more and more land being cleared to work. This was especially the case during Greece and Roman times where they didn't have access to concepts like crop rotation or new world foodstuffs. Wide-scale deforestation in these areas leading to erosion, mudslides, drought, and desertification. Pliny the Elder himself was worried the entire boot of Italy would fall into the ocean in the absence of trees holding it together. Spaghetti, it has been 10 whole dang-ass minutes. Give us some fantasy application for this information, or I'm gonna accuse you of being a fake gamer. Absolutely. Me, Spaghetti DM, Spaghetti, author of Iron Bigot, and at least 2 science fiction settings I'm casually working on in the background. As far as I'm concerned, the definitive core cereal societies are humans, halflings, and centaurs. Humans I typecast as being acceptable at growing both wheat and rice, but truly exceptional at growing corn. Mayan folklore is correct. The gods made humans out of corn to make corn. Corn is too tall for halflings and lacks the necessary dietary protein centaurs need to sustain themselves. But in the hot open lands that humans dominate, corn is king. Corn is the definitive human cereal. Corn is also the reason there's always more humans than any other species expects there to be. Halflings, of course, excel at all forms of agriculture in the exact same way dwarves do with mining and metallurgy. But if I had to make them good at one cereal in particular, it would probably be rice. I know halflings are a Western fantasy creature, but halflings being good at making rice patties makes sense to me due to their overtly communal nature. I'm also a big fan of halflings being an extremely populous race, and rice will do that to you. Centaurs, I think, have the same problem as humanity. Once they get access to gluten, they basically go insane. They trade the bow for the plow, and they never really go back. Centaurs are a definitive wheat culture. They're too clumsy to grow rice. Corn is just empty calories to them, so it's gotta be wheat. Not just wheat though, but oats, rye, and other weedy niche pseudo-cereals like sorghum, millet, and buckwheat. Not just because African striped zebra centaurs are the absolute height of fashion, but because of both the added nutritional content and the inherent hardiness these pseudo-cereals possess compared to other cereal crops. Because even with access to agriculture, I would still expect centaurs to lean way more towards hunting and herding, leaving periods where they're not 100% looking after their fields as closely as they could. I think that about covers it. Please cultivate all these cool cereal facts in your mind and seed them the next time you create or consume fantasy media. See you next time!